Okay, I'll jump in. This will be a difficult evening because I have a new kitten who's complaining for being away from home. So this is the last reading group about There Never Was a West. We started some months ago, and we had some difficulties in organizing, but it was a very important reading, in my opinion. But the chapter we are discussing tonight is, in my opinion, the most important of the text, and also something that is quite standalone in the context of this paper. Overall, There Never Was a West is about democracy and about where should we look for the origins of democracy, and what's more important, where should we look for concepts to think democracy. David delves in those origins and shows very well, in my opinion, what happens when you just look to the Western tradition, and when you believe in this fairy tale of a Western tradition, and what happens instead when you look at what Walter Benjamin called hidden history, the history of the oppressed. If we look at this history, the real origins of the freedoms we imagine today, and of the democracy as we think of it today, are not in ancient Greece, but rather in the common thought that emerged in modern age through the contacts and also through the catastrophe of the expanding capitalism over the world. It's something that emerged from people meeting and having to live together and deal with each other without rules, and in a sort of melting pot that was also the result of a tabula rasa that capitalism made of former connections and rules. In particular, this last chapter of the text is the one that is the closest in David's writings to classical political philosophy. It deals with the notions of sovereignty, and in particular, it shows the contradiction between the idea of democracy and the idea of coercion, of a monopoly of violence. You cannot have both. Proves, in my opinion, beyond discussion, David. I have to deal with my cat. Vasily, do you have anything to add to this short introduction? And our idea in this reading group was mainly to have everybody saying something and giving us our at least some quote to discuss. Max Lawson last reading group showed us a wonderful video about the first part and slipperiness of Western eye. And so I invite everybody who has anything to say to join us. But Vasily first, please.
Oh, why me first? No, I'm happy to I'm happy to let people express themselves. I may jump in tonight, and we'll see. Anyone has a video to show or something like that, or a small presentation or something? Anyone want to kick off?
No, okay. I just.
I think Avi has his hands up.
Just before sort of discussion, there was 2 sections that I didn't actually understand. So I was just wondering if anyone could help me understand them. One was a more broad point, which is on page 364. Graeber says, the Zapatista decision to embrace the term, it seems to me, was more than anything else a decision to reject anything that smacked of politics of identity. So I assume I know what that means, but I'm not entirely sure. But the more complex part for me was on 366, where he says, consider here, for example, the view of human nature one might derive generalizing from the experience of driving to work on the highway, as opposed to the view one might derive from the experience of public transportation. And then he goes on to say, yeah, the American love affair with a car was the result of conscious policy decisions by political corporate elites. He's using an example to explain something before, but I don't actually understand how that example explains it. Sorry, there's 2 very particular points. So if it's difficult, maybe come back to it later, but I didn't understand that example.
Well, the issue about highway transportation is the ugly mirrors. That is something David dealt with in the previous chapter of this text. He says those in power are always interested in dismantling democracy and showing to the people ugly mirrors like circus or mobs or things that prove that people are not able to of self-governing, and what's in highway transportation is the result of many individual decisions inside a very specific frame. And in this specific frame, just as in elections, you have a distortion of what people can be and can do together. Being together, and democracy is not everybody per se. It's consensus, it's discussing, it's deliberation, something very different from what we experience in spectacles, in circus, in talk shows, or in highways. At least this is my reading of this text. Maybe Avi, okay.
I got it now. Thank you. I don't know why I didn't get it before. Thanks.
But it's the identity in question is the Maya identity, though. If I understand it well, I think it's just like it's a bit of a
Sorry, I need 1 minute for technical stuff.
What? Oh yeah, sure.
And I don't understand, Avi, what was the question about Zapatistas? Why did they use the word democracy, although they understand something different by democracy than something that was used by the Mexican government? That was the question.
And it was just a throwaway comment that Graeber makes there, which is the decision to embrace the term seems to me was more than anything else a decision to reject anything that smacked politics of identity. It's just that it's one of the rare occasions that Graeber even mentions the politics of identity. So it's kind of like I've never understood what he thinks about it. So it might have given a clue. I don't really want to get bogged down in it. It was just
it's very
anyone.
Yeah. I guess I suggest that David understand that you know, if Zapatistas will use something like some of their own words, you know, and their own understanding of what democracy, then they will. It will be easier for them, but they will escape using more universal language. So in a way, they took the interpretive labor upon themselves and started to use the words that we think we know. What does it mean? And then describe it in their own terms. And they did it with many other things, like, for example, good government. So they use the word government, but they add these things, good government, and then that's allow them to explain what do they mean by that.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
I thought your other point on the car was really interesting because the example of the viewpoint of the car is that democracy or the governing structure changes how society makes decisions, how they organize their life, for example, how they use transportation, and then that changes people. They come to expect particular ways of doing things, and thus you end up with a bunch of people using automobiles, and then you have a space where people would say, well, we want a democracy where climate change is dealt with, but people using automobiles feel like, well, yes, but then that would mean I couldn't use my car. You know, so the idea that a decision is made that then affects how society is organized means that future decisions will be influenced by the past decisions. And if your original viewpoint of democracy wasn't really an open democracy, it was something like this republic where you voted for elected officials and it wasn't really very democratic at all, then that starts to solidify a vision of what democracy is. So it becomes a feedback loop. So I think that's part of the point that he's making there as well.
And if you think of the point that he makes in the article on turning modes of production inside out, where he likens the commute to work to the Middle Passage that enslaved people took from Africa to the New World as commodities, he sort of, you know, draws his comparison that the dread that people feel on their way to to work is that the social death. It's a process of social death. And so if you think in the United States, where we're glued to our automobiles, our social death is individuated to the extreme, whereas to compare that to, say, Denmark, where I believe there's more public transportation, it's still social death, but at least it's a more collective, mutually organized process. Good times. Thanks. I screwed you up, Simona. Sorry.
No, I have a bad connection. I lost half of what you were saying, and I have a kitten protesting for my attention, but I can present it to you. So sorry. The most interesting part of this text for me is the very last, that is the most philosophical. The one between that argues about the organizing states, the impossible marriage. States cannot, by their nature, ever truly be democratized. They are, after all, basically ways of organizing violence. The American Federalists were being quite realistic when they argued that democracy is inconsistent with a society based on inequality of wealth, since in order to protect wealth, one needs an apparatus of coercion to keep down the very mob that democracy would empower. The main point of this text is, of course, that what the Federalists promoted was not democracy but republic, and that is not a government of equals for equals, and it's not a community government. And here he points out also the relationship between violence and property. You cannot have one without the other, and you cannot have democracy with violence and property, because property, and this is an issue that goes through all David's work, is Roman law property, and it is the way we see the state as an extension of property, of a property model. The monopoly of violence inside borders is the same as the monopoly of violence of the master inside his property. Everybody is king inside his property, means also that you reproduce a structure of violence and of somebody who has every right on everybody that is inside those borders. That is peculiar of Roman law. And what's happening now with, and this is the crisis of the state, is that we are projecting this model all over the world. And when you project this model all over the world, the contradiction between a government by the people and the state explodes, because you can't pretend to have a democracy inside a nation. Actually, in this text, David shows also how nationalism and racism are inevitably connected with a modern state as a monopoly of violence inside borders. And this connection is exactly in the fact that to pretend that you have a government by the people, you must pretend that the people is a unity, a uniform thing with a one will that can be represented by the sovereign. This is fetishism in a way. And you can have this fiction inside a national state with more or less at least the same language all over the territory. But the moment you pretend to have a world democracy, the impossibility of this comes to the scene. You cannot, 8 billion people cannot decide together for the whole world. So they can exist only when they are represented. They can exist only in a fictive way. And as soon as you accept this fiction, you have Italians, Russians, you have people not anymore as people, as many human beings. You have people in the sense of a unity, something that that is more than individuals, that is more than a sum of individuals, and is also more than the agreements and even the traditions, the morals, the customs, the ethics, the ways we share, and the values a community can share. It becomes more and more abstract, and it is this abstraction that creates racism and even war. Makes it possible, war, because it makes it possible for an individual to identify with this abstract thing that is the people, instead of identifying with his or her own community, with the concrete people they deal with every day, with the decisions you have to take in order to live together and cooperate at a low level, not in an abstract and a universal level, such as a state or Europe or the world. Well, any comment by now?
Kelly and Michael have got their hand up.
Kelly?
Yes, I'd like to contribute with a text from Lost People, which is the big study that David did, which I think inspired a lot of his further thinking. And it's really related to what you just said, Simona, linked to the people and relations to power and to sovereign. So royal power as a matter of gathering people together. So this very concrete link to power, making them all agree to royal rule. The kingdom was imagined as a grand assembly. But when such grand assemblies were actually held, assembled people expressed their agreement by offering asina. Asina are silver coins, so each time they assemble, they would give a silver coin to the king. In effect, creating the power by which they had just been brought together by giving this asina. The people became a people in their acts of recognizing a king who embodied their will to be united as a people. All this rather recalls European social contract theories. The analogy should probably not be pushed too far, but Hasina did, in fact, have to be presented to the sovereign whenever two of his subjects made a contract with one another. Legal documents show this was one of the principal ways royal ritual actually entered people's life. If a group of villagers agreed on the division of a piece of property, he gave other examples, but I'm giving this one based on what you just said, Simona, then Hasina had to be given to the king. Otherwise, the contractual agreement had no legal standing. It was as if royal power had to be created over and over again, as if people continually had to recreate the power which bound them together in a moral community, to recreate the force which guaranteed it. So I think it's a good illustration of what we just said, and also a link to the to what you said in the introduction, the notion of sovereignty, of community, government, of people seen as human beings and not abstract.
Michael?
Thanks, Kelly. That was great. Kind of quote and connecting this work to all of his other work. I was going to say I do something slightly different, but on the same theme of the people, and I just point out a very common error that David has made on page 363. He talks about people's global action, which many of us were involved in the PGA, and the apostrophe is as if it was people, comma, S, like people of the world, people's global action. And in fact, the actual spelling, although it often gets misspelled, is people's apostrophe. So the people's is plural. And there was I've always, I guess in many ways, because what the People's Global Action was linking many movements across the world to deal with states. So within an individual state, people will contest the role of the term "the people" being used for a republic that, or a representative democracy or a representative state where, you know, the state acts in the name of the people. And so people are, many times anarchists are very suspicious of the word "the people." And so there was all kinds of confusion around this term, the people's global action. And I think in part, and I don't know, I'm trying to do an oral history project with the People's Global Action Oral History Project, and this is the type of questions that we'd love to know exact answers for. But I think in part it was people's plural because they were, some of them were, the indigenous people were arguing with the state processes, and if they were named a people, then they suddenly got rights as a group. So if they're just like, so I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this, but the idea of the peoples was the other way to explode the term people, was to allow everyone to be a people, not just states, and that allowed community interest. The word sovereignty is also in the anti-globalization movement, has a lot of meaning. So in particular, food sovereignty was a term that many people who were anarchists said, "Oh, we don't like sovereignty, abolish the king." But many of the people working on that thought, well, we want sovereignty and within our area to have food around that. So I think there's some some different ways to think of the term people when you have it at a global level where you're, and by pluralizing the word people, you kind of confuse that system of one state, one people, and the government will represent the people. But here we have multiple peoples, and they are contesting for a position within an interstate global framework.
Avi, you had raised your hand.
I'll just wait for a bit because I always ask too many questions.
Okay. Yes, of course.
I actually didn't understand the example of Kellic because so when people give the coin to the king, they kind of recreate all the time this unity of being the kingdom. So it's an example of opposite than representative democracy and the republic when they bound by law and by abstraction. Am I right?
They constantly need to reconfirm who is the sovereign and who has the power. So basically, if one day they decide not to do it anymore, then the power is lost. So it's a way to be real sovereign as people.
But if we know that it's not possible to be sovereign as people in general, then basically it's a special tools that everybody use, and these guys invented it or like use it in Madagascar, where the people can, with micro steps, every deal, every assembly, as you said, yeah, they have to reconfirm the unity, and they have the way to basically withdraw very easily, although we are in representative democracy don't have this way, because we have our tools of confirmed democracy is very limited, and you know, like just voting once every 4 years for one of the two people. We can't vote for the all the rules, the basic rules. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, for them it's every act, every time they assemble, every time there is a contract, they reconfirm that.
Yeah, and this is something dealt with in the fetishism as a social creativity. There is a page in There Never Was a West that gives some hints about it. Our philosophical, our theoretical model of when we talk of sovereignty, we are referring to a precise tradition that is comes from just naturalism, from Hugo Grotius, and then to of course Thomas Hobbes. And what's interesting is that even this tradition that looks like so much Western actually comes from markets from global markets of the time, and even from fetishism. Fetish was the object that represented a contract, and it's an external sort of deity that guarantees for a contract. In our modern age state, this role of guarantee of a contract has been taken by the state. And when we say sovereign, we talk of the one who decides at the last instance. And so the one that who has the ultimate power when there is a conflict, when there is a contract that has not been respected, when there is a decision that is difficult to make, or just when there is a decision that should be appointed to an external power that is not that of real people, but can only be that of the represented people. The sovereign in Hobbesian frame, that is a classical description of the model. The sovereign is the one that decides at the last instance, but also he can decide because he's outside the system, outside the community of humans. It's not a even if it's a king, even if it's a person, it's not a real person, it's a fictive person. It's the person that represents, that makes the multitude present, that makes the multitude one being. And this can be done only by putting the sovereign outside the system, because as soon as it is inside the system, it is inside the conflicts. It's not anymore above it. And it's for this reason that it can only be a symbol. It can only be transcendent. It can be justified only if it represents, it is the representation of something bigger than the concrete mass of a multitude. This sovereign is a fetish. But what's different from the contracts that are guaranteed by this quasi-god that is a fetish, is that the sovereign is not only an external force, quasi-deity, a symbol. It's also the one that owns violence, that has the legitimate power to enforce decisions through violence, that has the legitimate power to evict people from their houses because they couldn't respect the contract of paying the rent. It's very concrete violence justified through a transcendent power, through a self-appointed symbol that is outside the system. This play of transcendence versus immanence is all the structure of a modern state. And our time is kairos, a time of catastrophe. Catastrophe is a very interesting concept because it's not just, it's not simply a mess, it's not simply something terrible. Catastrophe in Greek means, strophe is turn. Catastrophe is a total turn, is the word upside down, is when something is so utterly destroyed that it's completely changed. Catastrophe has to do with change, and ours is definitely a time of catastrophe when all this construction of a modern state and of markets guaranteed by modern state, and everything is collapsing, and we are in desperate need to think other ways to self-organize. And the first thing we need to think those other ways is to remove delusions. And this of sovereignty is one of those delusions. But it's interesting that when we claim for our power as people, we talk of sovereignty. We want our food sovereignty, means we want power over what we eat. Sovereignty is power, and that when we talk of food sovereignty, we are using the framework of this symbol that is sovereignty. So we are accepting the idea of a sovereignty of people that is in fact a self-harming concept, because the sovereignty, since the sovereignty is something outside the system, is something transcendent, the only possible sovereignty of the people is when you think of people as a unity, as something transcendent that goes beyond concrete promises and agreements and human relationships. And if this text does anything interesting, is to show us what happens when you put our ideas of self-government, of freedom, of equality into the frame of the philosophical tradition of sovereignty, for example. Sorry for being so long. I know Avi wanted to say something, but I was launched and I couldn't stop. And maybe Nika wants to say something after Avi.
I had a different question, but just following up, I'm glad that you got to food sovereignty. I would just wheel back round to what Michael said earlier. I don't think the deal is done, but just as Graeber talks about the way that Zapatistas are wielding the concept of democracy, I would say that the outcome is still unresolved as to whether or not the concept of sovereignty within food sovereignty, something that I'm quite familiar with, is as negative as you put it, Simona. I would say that it is trying to be reappropriated precisely in the way that Graeber is describing at the end of the paper. Although I share your worries myself, but this is a conversation that I'm always trying to, how aware are people that are using it. So I share your concerns, but I wouldn't be so, just to be provocative, I wouldn't be so purist about it. I had just another little comment quickly, which was I thought that related to this as well, at the end of 366, where he talks about what you were saying, Simona, about right-wing solutions as inspired leaders who can stand outside, but then contrasting that to left-wing solutions as in within the system. Whether I agree with it or not, it is kind of interesting to consider two phenomena that happen around us. One is, for example, maybe a less interesting one is Brexit, which is a non-constitutional country appealing to the idea of taking some new basis, because a non-constitutional one is not quite the same, at least in theory, as the way that Graeber puts it. You can change your constitution as you go. The more interesting one is states that fracture and people try to take their autonomy, but then try to establish a new sovereignty. But obviously the will or the interest there is to try to start from scratch and say, okay, we got stuck in this one constitution. Maybe we cannot have a direct democracy, but maybe we can stick a new constitution by making a little autonomous, Catalan or whatever the hell it is. So there is something interesting in that to me, just from hearing. I hadn't thought about it until you said what you said, that the impulse is interesting. Maybe the result is not so interesting. Anyway, thanks.
I don't know if Nika was asking for the floor. If not, Matteo, and then Vasily.
Can I go, or Nika, you want to speak? Okay. No, I was just following up on what Simona said and Avi said. I was wondering about the using or not some kind of terminology. I'm not keen on the philosophical background of the word sovereignty, but I was just thinking of a quote, I think is from Domination and Sabotage from Antonio Negri back in the 70s, in which at some point he speaks about the way he uses the word power, and he says, like, it's not, I use the word power, but or we as proletarians, to use his language. We use the word power, but it doesn't mean the same thing as capitalist power. So I think there's something interesting in that he talks about like non-homologous translation, I think. And to me, it appeals a bit of what I thought about what David says about the Zapatistas' use of democracy. To me, seems some kind of, the word democracy is some kind of, let's say, tactical use of the word in order so that it can relate more to other people. So yeah, I don't know. I think this going back and forth, like trying to reappropriate maybe sometimes words that have been reappropriated can be interesting. And I was thinking about something else, but I know, yeah, about this the question of constituting constitutional order through violent popular revolutions. I think it brought me back to the critique of violence from Benjamin, where he talks about the potentiality of the general strike, social general strike, that would pass through a stage of violence in order to destitute rather than institute law, like getting out of law, which means getting out of states, getting out of property. And that seems to me more of a anarchy-related perspective on it. And yeah, I don't know, just drop it there if anybody wants to react.
Vasily?
Yeah, I don't have much to say about the second point, but following Matthew's first point, I did also had some difficulties with this text. because I couldn't really understand. Okay, because it talks about a lot of contradictions, and this is, I think, the second one of the contradictions is the one that you mentioned that Walter Benjamin pointed out. But another one, which is probably even more obvious, is this idea that sounds like an oxymoron, that there can be a democratic state, and at least today, and it might not be the case of all states, but the state must always assume somehow that there is a democratic principle behind it, and the fact that there are things, the states have things that for people who run these states represent democracy, whether it is the elections, or it can be some sort of consultation where you have the prime minister meeting with the people, or whatever. So states, and at least the ones we know, are contradictory because they're functioning indeed in a oligarchic manner, but at the same time they must claim that they have a kind of a democratic underpinning, as I was saying. So having said that, you can also, I think it's not impossible to try to impose some sort of democratization of its institutions. But for me, it is not something that is contradictory. The state is contradictory, true, and David Graeber gave many examples in this short passage. But nevertheless, it might be possible to force it. I mean, only if we are we have enough people, if there are sufficient forces to do so, to bend its institutions or its practice in a democratic direction. I was wondering if it is something that David Graeber is pointing to, like it's one of the directions he's pointing to, or not at all. I know he's kind of in favor of this notion of prefiguration. This is something that one of us was mentioning, building something new in the old shell. And I don't remember, I think he talks about that in this paper about the managerial class, right? To be, I don't know, something to double check. And I was also, it comes back to the very beginning of the debate, but because I didn't say much about identity politics, I think David Graeber was not too much in favor of it. And for something that Nika asked me to do, I read many of his tweets, and he talks about that in some of them. And I'm going to share it to you, but it's actually quite funny. Basically, it says that identity politics is so Christian, basically, because it's all about guilt and, I have privileges and blah, blah, blah. But I think he's also saying that, there is a variety of politics of identity. There are different types of identity politics, and some of them are probably okay. Especially when you talk about different types, you have to ask who is actually doing identity politics. If it is some white privileged kids, it might not be. I don't know. I don't want to speak for David Graeber. I don't really know what he thought about that, but I'm going to share the tweets anyway.
May I, Avi, or yeah, if I may, starting from identity politics, I think this text is quite clear about identity politics. Identity politics makes sense as soon as identities are politically relevant. As soon as you are not people in the sense of many people, of a multitude, but you are a people identified as a Jew or or American or Bolivian or so on. That is identity politics is relevant when you build the fiction of a people that exists despite all the differences, that all the many identities we all share. Somewhere David makes the example of a merchant, a Jewish merchant in the Indias. Was he a merchant or a Jew or a member of the community of Thessaloniki or a Greek? Everybody has multiple identities, and it is only when you need the fiction of a people that those become politically relevant. As for, well, going back to sovereignty and to democracy, this text starts with something is emerging. The problem is what to call it. And that's why David thinks we need to rethink the name of democracy. Because this is a name we stubbornly use to mean what we want, the self-government we want. And despite the attempts to reduce it to the market that is elections. By the way, I'm so in the system that I'm MP candidate in this moment, and this is ridiculous. But despite all the attempts to reduce democracy to this competition, this aristocratic, oligarchic competition that is elections, and despite the ugly mirrors that show us the mob instead of the communities, and despite all the violence that is connected with this fiction of the existence of a general will, Rousseau's general will, we keep using this term. We keep claiming our will to have democracy, just as we use the term sovereignty to mean we want power over our lives. So it's, yes, of course, we must be careful because sovereignty means a very specific thing, but words change of meaning when people use them. And if we use the term sovereignty to claim our power over our lives, it's okay to use this term. Only speaking of Italy, we have, it's quite meaningful, in my opinion, that those trying to imitate the extreme right in claiming Italians' sovereignty over their lives are using this term. This is why I think it's dangerous, but it's always also ambiguous because words have the meaning we give them. What Benjamin did was to show that what's behind this fetish of the sovereign is actually violence, is the monopoly of violence, and the external foundation of the system of laws, of the legal system, is the fact that you cannot found a state, you cannot found a legal system without without violence, without war or a general strike, without imposing something. As soon as you want a legal system, something given and guaranteed by violence, you have you need sovereignty, you need something outside the system. In Benjamin's critique of violence, this is very clear. You cannot have, the question is violence legitimate when you use it inside a due process, a due legal process? Benjamin says, yes, it is legitimate only if you forget about its violent foundation. What's outside the system is violence, is the war that gives place to a peace agreement. You cannot have a peace peace agreement without a war. One last thing, we are we talk of the state, whether we are for or against the state. I totally agree with Vasily. State is contradictory in itself. There is not such a thing as one state. There is a plurality of forces inside a shell. Nevertheless, the state as a system is something and has effects. But what we are dealing with now is not states, it's not only states. It's also, what's emerging is a global system, a global bureaucracy, something that goes over national states, that still exist and have consequences, because you cannot have markets with the power of states to establish them. But we also are witnessing the collapse of the state system, because it's right now commercial agreements can be enforced even against states. So by world bureaucratic systems like WTO or International Monetary Fund, these are different forces from the state. Well, sorry for being so long.
But I just said that, you know, my point was not to say that there are contradictions, because I think this is quite obvious, but it is more that is it actually, is there any hope of like making the are institutions like extant institutions more democratic, or is it just like a lost cause? I think, you know, you can think about like things like sortition. Is it something that we can try to fight for, or you know, or tons of examples like that. I know that I think David Graeber was kind of I mean, yeah, kind of in favor to that, but I don't know if he wrote at all about that. I found an interview where he talks about it, but yeah, so that's my question.
Il gatto sta dormendo da qualche parte, non so dove, ma si è messo tranquillo. Sorry.
Niente, volevo solo dirti che non riesco a mettermi qui a guardarlo perché è salita Sheila e io sto con lei e le spiego che va tutto bene.
Ok. Sorry. Yes, and also the lecture that Al-Pasha gave in honor of David is very interesting about sortition and about the indigenous people's tradition that can be a substitute for our democracy. My problem with sortition and with deliberative assemblies like those that are asked for by Extinction Rebellion is how to enforce the decisions. Because right now it is just a democracy octroyée given by the power of the state without real results, and it risks to backlash as an ugly mirror. You spend months in deliberative assemblies chosen by sortition, and then all of your work is just showed as a medal and then put into a tiroir, cassetto, well, thrown away. Michael and Carla didn't speak before, please. A drawer. Thank you, Vasily.
Go ahead, Carla.
Go ahead, Michael. I think you raised your hand first.
Okay, I just had a question. It seems rather simple, but I realized that the title of the part 5 is The Crisis of the State. And so the beginning talks about this. We've come back to the example of social movements and all of these in relationship to the state. And David Graeber is saying, oh, there's not a crisis of social movements, there's a crisis of the state, and these social movements are demonstrating that. But do you think that he's using that term, the crisis? What is the crisis of the state that is being referred to here? Is he using that term to talk about something specific that was going on during the period of 1990 to 2008, which was kind of when the anti-globalization movement rose up, and there was a huge amount of confrontation against the World Trade Organization and specifically states organizing property rights into other states, like the idea that a state, the WTO would have sovereignty to protect property rights against local states having their people control some issue? Or is he just saying the crisis of the state is a permanent thing, and it is what Simona is talking about, the whole end of the argument, this part, the impossible marriage. You cannot marry a state which requires coercion to make decisions with democracy, which requires agreement to make decisions. So what's the crisis of the state? Is he talking about specifically a crisis in this period I would say 1990 to 2008, or is it more the crisis of the state that David is referring to is the impossible marriage?
Carla, do you want to go first?
Sorry, I was on mute. I was saying that I don't have a specific answer to that. So if anyone has something specific to say regarding that question, that you could go ahead. What I understood of the text is that the solution he's proposing here is building spaces beyond the state, autonomous zones that are independent from the state, as if, yeah, what you were saying, Michael, there's something fundamentally incompatible between the state and direct democracy. I understood that his position in this text was that there is an impossible marriage. So what the anarchist solution would be to build and cultivate autonomous spaces, self-organized spaces, and then also work in their connection. And I really like a word that he uses here that is engulf. And so maybe these autonomous spaces grow and grow and they start to connect with each other globally until finally they will engulf the world, as he says in one line. And I also like the idea of growing in between. There is also this idea of autonomy, not in this institution or that institution, but growing in between, from the middle. And it reminds me of the concept from Deleuze that he also talks about the middle and proceeding by the middle, like rhizomes grow from the middle of things and they start spreading horizontally from that point, that it could be anywhere. It could be a reading group. It could be, I don't know, whatever small space we want to take for a start. It could be anywhere, but I understood that it had to be something autonomous from the state, because if you go that way, then you become a state. So yeah, that's what I understood from his position in this text. Maybe in other texts it's different.
Yeah, if I may, I think the crisis of the state is both in the emerging of a borderless, a word bureaucracy, and from the cracking of the fiction of the people produced by this world government that is emerging. But yes, one of the things that are fascinating for me in David is that he allows us to see what's already there. And that's, as Carla was saying, growing in the between, in the autonomous zones, in the spaces in the between, he says in this essay. Well, at page 364, he talks of with Mignolo of border thinking, and he points out democracy did not emerge from anybody's discourse. It's not about a legislator. It's not about vanguards. It's the concrete experience of people that it's, as Vasily was saying before, building in the old shell. Building in the old shell and prefiguration is quite an anarchist mantra. It's what anarchists look at as a practice, as a solution. And even what I was saying about sortition before is when you think of sortition, the way Extinction Rebellion asks to government. But if it's sortition as a way to practice self-governing, it's as we say in Italian, another pair of shoes. It's a totally different thing. So what's important to me is, and what's the other side of the crisis of the state, is that the contradictions are exploding because of the world bureaucracy, because the fiction of the people cannot stand this situation. And inside this contradiction, not just something, many things, many experiences are emerging. And yes, I think it's there that there's hope. And this text teaches us to look at this experience, at those things that are emerging. Before being quiet, in a fortnight, on September the 15th, we'll have a second round of discussion about Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, with some very good scholars of Benjamin's. So please attend this meeting. That will be great, in my opinion. Sorry, I cannot see if anybody raise her hand. Nika?
Yeah. So I just want to say that it's really interesting for me to think about what you said, emergence of international government, world government. I kind of, yeah, it's the first notion. It's fascinated to think about that. I just simply say, like it's definitely connected to the war that's going on and to climate crisis that only can be solved by the big powers, by all these conflicts, and by all these bureaucratic organizations, Western organizations, being in crisis now and kind of colliding with China openly already. So I think it's so interesting. I would like to explore it, and yeah, maybe we can find some text to discuss that. I'm extremely interested to do it as a special conversation if anyone has an idea and the interest.
David said something about it, both in a conference about Rojava that is on YouTube. I can send you the link, and the preface to Utopia of Rules is very much about it.
Mm-hmm.
Avi?
Just to follow on from what Nika was saying. Oh, I see Physically's got his hand up. I'll try not to be too long. Not in the technical sense that Graeber describes bureaucracy, but in the daily use of it by people who work in social services. I think there is some interesting work to be done to explain that a critique of bureaucracy is not a critique of organization or even in some sense administration. This is lost within popular conversation around this point, and I think that could do with some elaboration relating to what you're talking about, Nika. So what I mean is it seems to be very difficult to explain if someone is not familiar with, say, the Rojavan context, what this might mean. And I think it's also interesting next month, or well, now it's September, Wengrow is going to talk about their book in Finland, and just the person who invited him is a friend of mine, but who asked me to write a review about the book for their Finnish journal. And so the question for me was, well, I don't know anything about Finland, so I need to talk to some Finnish people. But the idea of Finland as a kind of, well, at least if you belong to the Finnish state gang, then, you know, that mafia gives you more than if you belong to the US state gang. So why would you want to consider the questions of dawn of everything if you belong in quite a nice gang? So I don't know, there's I feel like that speaks to something that you were talking about, Nika, and I feel like a lot more elaboration on that. And I think the globalizing of it in this article helps with that instead of thinking with it within the Finnish context. But anyway.
It's funny what you've just said, Avi, reminds me of, I watched a film yesterday called 120 Beats Per Minute about the ACT UP movement in Paris. And there is something like that in one of the meetings. There is one guy presenting the research of laboratories on AIDS. And some of the activists are really angry about it because they're like, you are basically conveying the lab's propaganda and so on. It's actually quite interesting because I think with XR and ACT UP, there are similarities because they, ACT UP was saying, yeah, we don't have time, we are dying, which was, they were dying. And people of XR are saying kind of same thing, they even the symbol, the hourglass or whatever. But what I wanted to say actually was about what Michael mentioned before, about crisis and the notion of crisis. And when he was talking about it, it was like, what he's talking about, we haven't read the same text. Because I was actually reading the French translation, and they don't talk about crisis in the French translation. The title is different. It's that fundamental contradiction between blah, blah, blah. So it's different. And I read the text again, and I don't know what is he actually talking about. I don't know what the crisis is, what is the crisis he's talking about. So I don't have any answer for that. But I was like also wondering why he actually uses this term, because the term crisis is, I think, very problematic, because people who talk about crisis are usually people who are quite happy with the crisis because they know how to solve it. They are people who know, and they are rulers, they are experts, and so on. So there is this management of crisis that is actually why we hear the term crisis so often now from our governance and so on. But I think there is another tradition, which is the Marxist tradition, where the crisis is actually considered is viewed as something of a possibility. Something is going to be destroyed, and you're going to create something new out of it, something like that. So I guess still don't know what David Graeber is talking about. Like, I don't know what crisis he's talking about. What is the crisis in question? But I think this is more like his tradition, especially because in his essays, he's mentioning, the Marxist background with Wallerstein and so on and so forth. Wallerstein talks a lot about crisis as well. So, but yeah, and in that sense, the Marxist sense.
Was there not a thing at the beginning when he talks about, the Western tradition and civilization, there's all these political theorists are saying the West is democracy and democracy is in crisis. And what they mean is they're saying our tradition is democracy and all these other traditions are tyranny. But we're in crisis because we have to kind of deal with these other traditions. Democracy is in crisis, but so maybe that is part of what he's saying. He uses the word crisis to say that actually that there's no crisis of democracy. Democracy is doing quite well. And that means that the people who claim the word democracy for their state property system are in crisis.
I think it's actually even worse than that, because the crisis of democracy is actually a report written by Michel Crozier and Huntington, and I think there are 3 authors. I don't remember the last one. And basically, what they're talking about is that, oh wow, the crisis of democracy is that because there is too much democracy, and this is why the US is struggling at the moment, and this is why they should restore their authority by taming democracy down. So basically, they are against the same contradiction. They are claiming that they have democratic institutions, but at the same time, they're saying democratic life is something you have to fight against.
But I don't know if I if I understand well what is said about the crisis of the states, but I'm going to give my interpretation of it. Is there is a let's say double crisis in which the state, as we are used to know it, mainly like nations, is kind of crumbling down or losing some of its power related to the existence and enforcement through globalization and organizations such as WTO or FMI. I don't know if that's the word in English, but which actually, like those organizations supersede what the nation states we are used to. They supersede their power. At the same time, to me, they function as super states, some kind of super states, which somehow enforce violence through coercion on financial problems. And since they try to coerce that on such a global scale, peoples with an S maybe start to realize the, let's say, the problem with the state form, and then it gets into maybe some kind of crisis, which is keeps this sense of an opportunity also, as Vasily was saying. That's my interpretation of it.
So I have difficulties in switching from Obsidian to Zoom. I put in the chat a quote about Kairos, that it's from The Dawn of Everything. It's I think the last lines of the book. David spoke of Kairos. He never spoke of catastrophe. This is something that is fascinating me in this moment. But Kairos is a concept he used in The Dawn and in his conferences about debt on BBC. He says, and in depth in the book also, he stresses the idea that everything, this is a moment when everything is changing. That's why this is the dawn of everything, that this is if ever a moment when we can really make a change, take power on our lives, because times are shifting in a way. Sorry for jumping in so without asking permission. Was anybody asking for the floor? Sorry if I missed her or him. No. We are already 1 hour. Oh, thank you, Kelly. I still haven't read Lost. I am ashamed of it, but I will. So I think we could wrap up if nobody has anything to add, and really attend the next session on September the 15th, because Walter Benjamin is really related to all that we discussed tonight, and if Lisa will attend, it will be really a great session. So thank you, everybody.
Just before you go, Simona,
yes,
could you just give an idea of what's forthcoming in the coming months?
We are still adjusting, but we'll have Benjamin on September the 15th. We are going to have pairs in October. I think we are still we still need to set the date, but it will be most likely at the beginning of October. This is as for the reading groups, and then we meant to start a reading group about debt with Stephen as a leader, but I don't know exactly if it will be in January or in October. Maybe Stephen can tell us. And in the between, we'll figure out something for the reading group and the philosophical series. Maybe Nika wants to give us any, or Stephen or Vasily has or Kelly maybe has something to add. But
I think Stephen, we decided to start earlier that as once a month kind of long time reading group after the long reading group of Dawn of Everything that you made. And I don't know what date you discussed with Muna. When has it started?
You know, I don't know off the top of my head, but you're right that we're shooting for an October start. That's right around there is what, somewhere in the fall is what we have in mind. So yeah, news to come.
Yeah, and then maybe in between, since we will have, like, it's impossible to have more than 2 reading groups a month for many people. So we will have one run by Stephen, and one will be either philosophical lectures, or maybe something that will pop up, or maybe Kelly probably will start after February when the pirate book will come out. And plus we hopefully will have, after the opening at the end of October, we will start to have once a month brain trust lectures that will be more related to climate change. Will be related to climate change. But yeah, I think it will be like one of the major projects of Institute. And then we see what happens with Archive. When the people start to work, how it's all come about. Like what kind of...
Muna's email for says reading groups debt to begin on 20th October with Steve Batchelor, and pirates in February, March 2023 to coincide with publication of book.
But the 28th October is not the launch of David Graeber Institute too?
28th, 29th of October, the launch. And but the reading group was the 20th of October, death.
That's a funny date. It's my 55th birthday. So I will have champagne with the reading group.
And of course, anybody who has suggestions, please tell it in the mailing list or here, or just write into Nika or me or Vasily. I also saw a very interesting conversation about Whitehead started from the last lecture. So I wondered if we could have another round about Whitehead discussing those new ideas.
Yes, and I also want to propose somebody to discuss Roy Bhaskar. Maybe I should stop recording because we're like now in a free fall, yeah? I stop recording.